If there's one writer who defines the age of prose, it's him. His poetry is memorable, sure, but his prose is where his genius truly shines. Johnson began his career doing what we'd now call hack work, odd writing jobs to make a living. Early on, he worked for Edward Cave, reporting for the Gentleman's Magazine. But here's the twist. Johnson didn't actually attend Parliament sessions. Instead, he made up the speeches, rewriting them so that the politicians sounded far more eloquent than they really were. That early practice in imitation helped shape his confident rhythmic prose. Then came the project that would make him immortal, Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, published on 15th April 1755. This is one of the most frequently asked facts in exam. He was paid 1,500 guineas, about 1575 pounds, for the job, and though he had promised to finish it in 3 years, it actually took him 7. What's truly astonishing is that he worked almost single-handedly with only a few clerks for assistance. The dictionary became the most influential reference book in English for over a century and a half, 173 years to be exact, until Noah Webster's dictionary appeared in 1828. Walter Jackson Bate even called it a monumental scholarly achievement. Johnson included definitions, grammar notes, quotations from respected writers, and examples from everyday London speech. Even his one-volume version from 1756 stayed popular into the 20th century. But Johnson wasn't just a lexicographer. Between 1750 and 52, he produced The Rambler, a periodical essay series that followed the example of The Spectator. These essays came out every Tuesday and Saturday and spoke directly to the rising middle class, trying to help them find their place in polite society. The Rambler ran for 208 issues. And that number 208 is a regular exam question. The essays are dense, abstract, and moral in tone, classic examples of what critics call Johnsonese. That means long, Latinate sentences, rich in rhythm and logic. One of his most famous lines from The Rambler reads, "It ought to be the first endeavor of a writer to distinguish nature from custom." This quote, also asked in exams, sums up his belief in moral clarity and intellectual discipline. A few years later, Johnson published another periodical, The Idler, 1758-60. This time, the tone was lighter, the essays shorter and more casual, often written like letters. The series had 103 essays, another exam favorite. It was printed weekly in the Universal Chronicle. Interestingly, one piece, The Vulture, was dropped because of its anti-war message, replaced by an essay about debtors in prison. Then in 1759, Johnson wrote The History of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. And here's the moving part. He wrote it in just a week to pay for his mother's funeral. And that fact has been directly asked in exam. Its original title was The Choice of Life, which also appears in exam questions. Rasselas isn't really about plot, it's a philosophical tale, exploring happiness, ambition, and the futility of chasing perfection. Every character represents a viewpoint, and Johnson's tone is reflective, grave, and full of worldly wisdom. In his later years, Johnson wrote less creative work but continued to shape English prose. His journey to the Western Islands of Scotland shows his skill as a travel writer, mixing observation with moral reflection. And his final major work, Lives of the Poets, 1779-81, stands as one of the finest collections of literary criticism ever written. His essays on Milton, Pope, Dryden, and Gray remain influential even today. Johnson's criticism always leaned toward classical ideals, balance, reason, clarity, and moral truth. Yet behind that grand, formal style was a man of great humanity and humor. His prose remains powerful not just for its intellect, but for its energy, that virile style, as critics like to call it. Dr. Samuel Johnson's Preface to Shakespeare, published in 1765. And yes, this text has been asked again and again in exam. Now, Johnson's preface runs about 72 pages, a long, thoughtful introduction to his edition of Shakespeare's plays, and it's often called the first truly modern piece of Shakespeare criticism. In this essay, Johnson does four major things. He explains Shakespeare's greatness, especially his portrayal of human nature. He points out his faults and weaknesses. He compares Shakespeare's plays to other drama of his age. And finally, he gives a brief history of Shakespearean criticism and editing up to the mid-18th century. So let's start with Johnson's central idea. He argues that Shakespeare's greatness lies in his deep understanding of human nature. Shakespeare, he says, is above all writers, the poet of nature, the poet that holds up to his readers a faithful mirror of manners and of life. This line has been directly asked in exam. For Johnson, Shakespeare's characters aren't shaped by time, place, or fashion. They're universal. They represent common humanity, the same passions and principles that move people in every age. Johnson writes that nothing can please many and please long unless it reflects general nature. This, he says, is why Shakespeare has lasted centuries. His plays are full of real men and women, not artificial types. Shakespeare has no heroes. Johnson says, another famous exam line, his scenes are occupied only by men who act and speak as the reader thinks he should himself have spoken or acted. This, according to Johnson, is Shakespeare's true genius. He approximates the remote and familiarizes the wonderful. In other words, even when he writes about kings, ghosts, or witches, the emotions feel real. But Johnson isn't blind to Shakespeare's faults. In fact, he's one of the first critics to balance praise with careful criticism. He says that Shakespeare often violates the unities of time and place. For example, Hector from Troilus and Cressida speaks as if he were living in medieval England rather than ancient Troy. This kind of historical inaccuracy has been asked in exam. Johnson also notes that Shakespeare's plots are sometimes loosely formed, that his language can be unnecessarily repetitive, and that he occasionally violates the harmony of blank verse. He even calls out Shakespeare for sometimes ignoring poetic justice, for letting the wicked live and the virtuous die, because Johnson says, people naturally like justice. But here's where Johnson's greatness as a critic shines. He accepts Shakespeare's faults as the marks of an untamed genius. Unlike neoclassical critics who demanded strict unity, Johnson valued emotional truth over structural perfection. He says Shakespeare's works endure because they appeal to experience, not to theory. What mankind have long possessed, he writes, they have often examined and compared, and if they still value it, it is because frequent comparison has confirmed opinion in its favor. That is the first 7 even expectivis erst, be mankind have long possessed. Johnson begins the preface with one of his most memorable meditations on literary fame. He warns that praises are without reason lavished on the dead, and honors due only to excellence are paid to antiquity. In other words, we sometimes praise the old just because it's old. But when we look carefully, he says, we find that works admired for centuries like Shakespeare's have lasted because they genuinely deserve it. The reverence due to writings that have long subsisted, Johnson explains, arises not from credulous confidence in the wisdom of the past, but from the fact that what has been longest known has been most considered, and what is most considered is best understood. That one line perfectly captures his faith in tradition and rational judgment. Throughout the essay, Johnson keeps returning to the same idea: literature should instruct and delight. This phrase, too, is often asked in exam. Poetry, he says, must teach moral truth while giving pleasure. And Shakespeare succeeds because he portrays real moral experience, not abstract ideas. Johnson also defends Shakespeare's comedies, calling them full of genuine wit and comedy of nature. He praises their lively dialogue and the way they reflect social manners. His view is that Shakespeare's genius in comedy is as great as in tragedy. At the end, Johnson elevates Shakespeare to almost Homeric status, calling him in effect the English Homer, while reminding readers that his fame now rests on time-tested admiration, not on fashion or politics. The poet, he writes, may now assume the dignity of an ancient and claim the privilege of established fame. And finally, one of Johnson's most powerful closing lines: Shakespeare's works are read without any other reason than the desire of pleasure and have received new honors at every transmission. In short, Shakespeare's genius has outlived envy, politics, and time itself. All right, let's talk about one of the cornerstones of English literary criticism, Samuel Johnson's Lives of the English Poets, published in 1781. This volume isn't just a set of biographies. It's a blend of life stories, character sketches, and critical essays on 52 poets from the 17th and 18th centuries, and yes, that number has been asked in exams. Johnson agreed to write what he jokingly called little lives and little prefaces to a little edition of the English poets. That phrase has shown up directly in exam papers, so keep it in mind. Now, Johnson's method was structured and deliberate. Each life had three main parts. First, a narrative of the poet's life, then a presentation of his character, and finally, a critical assessment of his poems. He arranged the poets roughly by date of death, not by birth. Another detail worth noting because it's been specifically asked in exam. The lives range from short sketches to full-length essays. Some are just a few pages long, while others, like the Life of Pope, are practically little books on their own. And yes, the Life of Pope is considered the longest and best of the entire collection. That's another exam favorite. Among the notable lives, Johnson wrote about Abraham Cowley, John Milton, John Dryden, Joseph Addison, Alexander Pope, William Collins, and William Shenstone. But Johnson didn't like everyone equally. He was famously prejudiced against Milton and skeptical about Gray, both of which have been asked in exam questions. For instance, when discussing blank verse, Johnson wrote that it makes some approach to what is called the lapidary style. It has neither the easiness of prose nor the melody of numbers, and therefore tires by long. This criticism has been lifted directly into exams, so it's worth memorizing. His comments on William Collins are also sharp. Johnson complained that Collins puts his words out of the common order, seeming to think, with some later candidates for fame, that not to write prose is certainly to write poetry. Again, that line has appeared word for word in exam. But the part that really made history is his Life of Cowley. In it, Johnson gives us his most famous definition of metaphysical poetry. He says the metaphysical poets were singular in their thoughts, that they affected the combination of dissimilar images, and that they made an inappropriate combination of wit and imagination. According to Taylor, Johnson, they often wrote verses but not poetry. He defines wit itself as a kind of discordia concors, a combination of dissimilar images, or discovery of occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. This definition, the discordia concors phrase, is one of the most quoted in all of English criticism and has been asked in exam countless times. He says, in short, that their ideas are yoked by violence together. It's an image that perfectly captures his mixed admiration and disapproval. Now, coming back to Pope, Johnson was a staunch defender of him. When critics asked whether Pope was really a poet, Johnson famously replied, "It is surely superfluous to answer the question that has once been asked, whether Pope was a poet. Otherwise than by asking, in return, if Pope be not a poet, where is poetry to be found?" That's another one that's appeared in exam. Still, Johnson considered Dryden greater than Pope, not because Pope lacked talent, but because Dryden, in Johnson's eyes, had more energy and range. Johnson also made a crucial distinction between a poet's life and his work. He noted a manifest and striking contrariety between the life of an author and his writings. In other words, a poet could be morally flawed and still create great art. But Johnson also said his biographical purpose was moral. He wanted to write in such a manner as may tend to the promotion of piety. Both of those quotations, the contrariety and the promotion of piety, have been asked in exam. So, what makes Lives of the English Poets special? It's not just literary history, it's Johnson's mind at work. He is witty, moral, judgmental, sometimes unfair, but always memorable. He favors poets from Dryden to Pope, looks skeptically at Gray and Collins, yet still admires Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard. In short, Lives of the English Poets gives us Johnson, the biographer, the critic, and the moralist all in one. It's the bridge between Augustan criticism and the modern study of English literature. And if there's one thing to remember for exam, Johnson never just wrote about poetry. He wrote about the poet as a human being.